Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico Episode 9, Across the Bear. I know I promised Esteban's fate at the end of the last episode, but before we get to that I wish to share two stories that are inextricably linked to New Mexico, despite neither taking place there. From Coronado, Night of Pueblos and Plains, quote, settlers at Santa Marta, near the mouth of the great Magdalena River, which pours its waters northward into the Caribbean Sea, heard the legend of the Gilded Man, told of a tribe in the south, on the high plateau of Bogota, whose chief was installed by an unusual rite of deep religious significance. He was anointed with oil and sprinkled with gold dust. Then, being pushed on a raft out upon the sacred lake of Guatavita, he dived into the water and washed off the gleaming metal. As part of the ceremony, the natives threw into the lake countless gold ornaments and precious stones as offerings to the gods. The gold-sprinkled chief became known to the Spaniards as El Dorado, the Gilded Man, end quote. The Spanish had many stories of the wealth, más allá, just beyond the existing frontier. Another Mexico, another Peru, ruled by another fantastical leader like Montezuma. These stories got mixed in with another medieval story, though. Quote, in the Middle Ages, so the old tale ran, 7 Portuguese bishops, pressed by the conquering Muslims, fled west into the ocean and founded the 7 cities of Antilla, where the Antilles get their name. Even the English had a similar version of this story, end quote. In some ways, these stories would become linked to New Mexico and to Esteban. Now to summarize our last episode, last time we wrapped up the tales of 3 of the 4 men that had walked across Texas, through parts of New Mexico and Arizona, south through Sonora, and back into Nueva Galicia in Mexico. Today we'll finish the story of Esteban. Cabeza de Vaca talked a lot about the mineral wealth that he thought he saw to the north. These stories set the Spanish imagination aflame. Perhaps these great cities mentioned would be another Mexico full of gold. Perhaps they had finally found India or China, and the wealthy and the populous civilizations within. These stories and the examples of metalworking he brought back would become conflated with the stories of Antilla. While the Spanish may have tried to get Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, or Castillo to lead another expedition to explore the far north, it seems that after losing Florida to the De Soto expedition, these 3 men moved on to other ventures. However, in 1536, Esteban would be purchased from Dorantes by Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza. It is possible that he even freed Esteban, but the record is sketchy. Cortez and some of his men were also aware of the rumors that de Vaca brought back, and were preparing their own expedition north to California, Florida, and New Mexico, which at the time was called the Tierra Nueva. Mendoza would continue to have trouble getting together a venture to confirm the tales that Cabeza de Vaca had spun. Failing to get enough soldiers for the job, he would inevitably turn to making it a missionary venture instead. Chosen for this venture was Fray Marcos de Niza. Fray Marcos had been involved in ventures all over South and Central America, including being in Peru during Pizarro's conquests there. After writings of his previous adventures were published, he was summoned to Mexico City, arriving around April 4th, 1537, where he'd meet with Mendoza and be entrusted to one Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, who would supervise the expedition. As a note, on the website I have uploaded a map of Coronado's approximate route, as well as Fray Marcos, which mirrors parts of Coronado's route. In total, this first expedition would consist of Fray Marcos, Fray Honorato, and Esteban. In March of 1539, they set out from Culiacan. Their goal was simple, to explore the validity of the stories that Cabeza de Vaca had told. Was there mineral wealth to the north? What about the great settlements? If so, what were the prospects for encomiendas in these settlements? Aside from these questions, the Spanish were still looking for a handful of other things they thought were right around the corner: India, China, and the Northwest Passage. Things would start out well for the expedition, retracing Cabeza de Vaca's steps until they reached Petalon, where Fray Honorato would fall ill and be forced to return. There's also some indications that he may have never actually been on the expedition. From here, the two would continue on to Vacapa. At Vacapa, Fray Marcos would send messengers to the coast to get knowledge of the people there. Here they would change the plan. To start, Esteban and Bartolome, a boy who had joined the party from one of the villages along the way, would continue onwards and send messages back to Fray Marcos, who would wait behind for these messengers to arrive from the coast, before following behind. This would allow Esteban to arrange for supplies from Fray Marcos as well. They decided on the following system for the importance of messages. If moderately important, they were to send back a cross roughly a palmo in length, a palmo being the width of 4 fingers. If higher importance, 2 palmos in length. And if it's something bigger than Mexico, they were to send back a large cross, the size of this cross being undetermined. Within a few days, Esteban sent back a cross as tall as the man carrying it. It was at this moment that the Spanish learned of the great kingdom of several rich cities to the north, Cibola, sometimes also called Cebola. Esteban also said he would wait for the friar. While excited, Fray Marcos continued to wait for the messengers from the coast. When they finally arrived, Fray Marcos quickly set out to catch up with his companions. Along the way, Marcos would gather more information about Cibola, including one nearby kingdom or city, Marata, which had appeared on ancient Greek maps. You can only imagine what he was thinking had they finally found Asia. When he caught up to where the messages had been sent from, he learned that Esteban had continued onward, despite their earlier agreement. As a result, Fray Marcos continued on and found another large cross at the next village. Here, Esteban promised to wait just past the next uninhabited region, which the Spanish called the Despoblado. Here we face a few different questions on why Esteban didn't wait like he kept promising he would. One theory is that the two men didn't like each other. Esteban would accept gifts from the villages they visited, including women, which the friar would most definitely not have approved of. This is countered by the fact that Esteban made sure the friar was well taken care of. Another theory is that Esteban wanted all the credit for the discovery of the next Mexico, so he's trying to cut Fray Marcos out. Either way, Fray Marcos continued on the path to Cibola, writing about what he heard or saw, including that the coast turned west, despite the fact that he probably did not travel to the coast. He continued up the Sonora River, down the San Pedro River, across the Aravaipa Valley, and finally across the Colorado Plateau, where he finally arrived in the general area of Cibola. Along the way, he heard more tales of the wealth of Cibola, including a description of the houses, including the fact that ladders were needed for access. This is a fact he most definitely did not fabricate. It was here he would learn that the Cibolans had killed Esteban. Supposedly it went like this, quote, "During this whole night they did not give us anything to eat or drink. The next day, when the sun was 1 lance high, Esteban left the building, and some of the principales with him. Immediately, many people came from the ciudad. When Esteban saw them, he started to flee, and we did too. Right away, they gave us these arrow wounds and injuries. We fell down and other dead people fell on top of us. We stayed that way until night without daring to stir. We heard great shouts in the ciudad, and saw many men and women who were on the lookout on the roof. We saw no more of Esteban. Rather, we believe they shot him with arrows, as they did the rest who were traveling with him. And we believe no one escaped except us." End quote. Despite the threat of danger, Fray Marcos may have continued on, reaching a cliff overlooking Hawaku, along the way learning of the Hopi Pueblos and hearing of their great wealth as well. Here he supposedly erected a cross before hurrying back to Spanish territory, arriving sometime in June 1539. But there's a different question here. As would be revealed later, it is possible that Fray Marcos never traveled to Cibola. He gets many details of the quote-unquote kingdom and surrounding provinces wrong. It is possible he turned around after learning that Esteban had been killed, assuming that his falsehoods would be ignored when the Spanish conquered the great civilization. His report could be summed up as such: the civilizations exist, here are their names, approximate locations, and what the people are like. Even if he did not majorly exaggerate the stories himself, he failed to correct rumors. In some ways, he may have seen no harm about the exaggeration if they saved souls, too. From No Settlement, No Conquest. Quote, "Fourth, the assertion that he had seen Cibola from a distance might have seemed to him only a technical untruth. After all, Esteban, the friar's advanced eyes and ears, had surely seen it. Marcos had seen it for weeks in his mind's eye, in conformance with the vivid and detailed descriptions many declared eyewitnesses had given him, as he walked northward through Sonora. His images, though, might have reflected a less than perfect understanding of what his informants tried to convey him. He and they shared no common language, and plenty of occasion existed for misunderstanding. Sometimes interpreters were available, sometimes not. On at least one occasion, Marcos and his informants resorted to pantomime." End quote. Due to these rumors and an ongoing unemployment issue, getting soldiers for a second expedition was far easier. In the meantime, just to make sure these rumors were really true, Viceroy Mendoza sent Melchior Diaz with a small party while announcing Coronado as leader. Diaz would proceed north until it got too cold to continue. His discovery would be that Cibola was not as wonderful as previously believed, but the Viceroy would not receive this information until well after Coronado had left. A competing expedition, De Soto's, had departed before Marcos had even returned, and many were already well along the route to be planned. At this point, I think it's important to take an aside to talk about Spanish exploration in the 16th century. To put it simply, the Spanish had a culture of strict primogeniture. This meant that if you were the younger son of a notable family, you had to find your own fortune. For many, going to the New World to seek a fortune was an easier path than staying in Spain. From here, they could self-fund an expedition to conquer new lands, getting to keep most of the profits, as long as they provided the crown their royal fifth. Another rule about expeditions of this period is that they were looking for encomiendas. An encomienda, put simply, is a vassalship contract. The encomendero was supposed to protect his encomiendas and provide them a good Christian education. In exchange, the people of the encomienda would provide tribute. Get a big enough encomienda and you could live the easy life. The Coronado expedition would follow this in a lot of ways. While there were grants from the crown to certain expeditionaries, they were small. Including with the expedition would be a naval component that was supposed to help resupply the expedition along the way. This would be led by Hernando de Alarcon. This was in a lot of ways a compromise, as Alarcon had the rights for exploration of the coasts of the Pacific. This compromise only occurred once the king stepped in. In all wealth would be evenly split between the two groups of Mendoza and Alarcon. Let's take a moment to discuss how Coronado ended up in New Spain and leading the expedition. Hailing originally from Salamanca in Spain, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado came to Mexico at the age of 25, following Viceroy Mendoza to the New World. He was the younger son of a prominent family. Shortly after his arrival, he would marry Doña Beatriz, the wealthy daughter of the former treasurer of New Spain, Alonso de Estrada. This marriage may have linked Coronado to an illegitimate branch of the Spanish royal family. In 1538, at the age of 28, he became governor of Nueva Galicia, after the previous governor was ousted on corruption charges. Only 1 year after Cabeza de Vaca returned to Spanish territory, it was a position he would hold throughout the expedition. He is widely regarded as a talented man from a well-off family. By all accounts, he is one of the best choices for the expedition. The best part was being that he was not one of Cortez's men. The goal of this expedition was conquest, not just exploration like it had been for Fray Marcos. The Spanish had heard of the unbelievably wealthy 7 cities of Cibola, and they wanted the encomiendas. In total, once Coronado was made the leader, took command of some 300 Spaniards, mostly from some kind of wealth, several hundred native allies and their families, and several priests, including Fray Marcos. Another component of the expedition that is rarely talked about is the nearly 1,500 Indian allies that accompanied the expedition. While probably joining for a variety of their own reasons, the exact details of their contracts aren't known. Some were probably promised wealth, others to keep any prisoners they captured. Others still may have been looking for promotion up the social ladders in place. These kinds of allies, in such numbers, were often the real reason for the success of Spanish expeditions, despite the usual portrayal of Spanish expeditions as this small group of men prevailing against hordes of Amerindian groups. Let's talk about the demographics of the expedition as well. Of the 70% of the expedition were ages known, almost 90% were between the ages of 13 and 29, so it was overwhelmingly young men. Of their equipment, it was American in construction. 90% of their equipment was Mexican Indian rather than European. Including other supplies, it is estimated it cost some 600,000 pesos. At the time, a laborer made about 100 pesos a year. To put it another way, the king's ransom paid for Atahualpa was about half this amount, after the royal fifth was taken out. It was a huge sum, and many men on the expedition went deeply into debt to fund it. To try and keep disruption of such a large group, they moved in smaller units and tried to pay for things in advance. At Compostela, they made their final muster on February 22nd, 1540, and took a head count. It is from these records that we get an idea of how well equipped the Spaniards of the expedition were, such as the number of horses and equipment carried. Viceroy Mendoza even traveled to Compostela to see the expedition off. From these records, we also learned that there were approximately 4 mares accompanying the expedition. It had long been a rumor that the Plains Indians received their horses from those that had escaped the Coronado expedition. While there were probably some that had escaped the Spanish, it is unlikely that a viable population could be formed from this expedition. Furthermore, there is no evidence that the Plains tribes had horses until the 17th or 18th century, 100 years or so after Coronado. They also had the Requerimiento, a document the Spanish had to read in full to encountered people. Basically, it read, become a vassal by choice or by force. A full reading of the document is going up at the same time as this episode. Leaving Cristobal de Oñate in charge of Nueva Galicia in his absence, Coronado set off towards Culiacan, still one of the northernmost Spanish settlements. Early on, progress was slow, about 10 miles a day. When they reached the Rio Santiago, they were further delayed, bringing the cattle across. I really like this description they give of how they had to cross the river. Quote, "Here the expedition was delayed 3 or 4 days, because it was necessary to take the sheep across the wide river, one by one, on horseback, in the arms of the caballeros." End quote. After crossing the river, they continued north. On the way, Lope de Samaniego would be shot by an arrow and killed in an attack from the Indians living in the area. Several other Spaniards would also be wounded. Coronado would round up and hang a group of people in retaliation. To replace Samaniego, Garcia López de Cárdenas would be promoted to his place. Somewhere around this point, Melchior Diaz returned, having made it to the area of Chichitikal, near the Gila River. He came bearing bad news about the prospects of that area compared to what Fray Marcos had promised. While the officers were ordered to keep said information secret, someone leaked it, and morale was dampened. Furthermore, he brought news that the Cibolans had sent messengers to Chichitikal to kill any Spaniards that made it to the area. As he approached Culiacan, Coronado was asked to wait to enter the city until after Easter. Before he was allowed in, the city and his expedition put on a mock battle that Coronado obviously won. Before he was allowed to enter the city, to much rejoicing, although one artilleryman lost his hand during the mock battle. Whether this artilleryman stayed with the expedition after this accident is not shared. While not really needed for our story, I think this anecdote deserves to be shared. While they were at Culiacan, the devil himself came and spoke to a soldier in Coronado's army named Trujillo. If he killed Coronado, he'd be allowed to marry Doña Beatriz and inherit her entire fortune. The brave soldier then told the story to Coronado, who rather than having the man put to death, ordered him to stay behind. This is probably what Trujillo had wanted all along. Coronado had serious concerns about what they would encounter as they went north. Diaz's reports had not done much to make him feel safe marching ahead. To scout out the terrain, he decided that he would take an advance guard to ensure that things were safe for the main army. The advance guard would be led by Coronado himself, while Cardenas would serve as maestro de campo. Tristan de Luna y Arellano would lead the main army. The main army was to wait for 20 days before following behind Coronado and stopping at the city of Corazones until further orders were given. This advance guard would consist of somewhere between 500 and 105 men, 500 to 800 of the Indian allies, and the friars. They would carry approximately 80 days' worth of food. The goal was to have the toughest and most veteran men ahead of the rest, including Melchior Diaz, Fray Juan Padilla, and Fray Marcos. I think it is here where we'll leave Coronado for now, with his advance party getting ready to leave Spanish territory and delve into the somewhat unknown lands to the north. As a reminder, maps of this expedition are available on the website. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled engineeringfire.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. And thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.